One of the reasons that we started this podcast is because there are so many people that need to find their way in life. It's hard at times to find a venue to say, where can I find answers in life for where I'm at? Here at Revive, we're here for you to find your way, right where you're at. Thank you for taking the moment to listen to this. Well, I'd like to welcome you to the podcast today. Today we're going to be talking about, I believe, a very, very significant podcast. We're going to be talking about the recovery of loss. All of us, sooner or later, we're going to be touched with the tragedy of losing a friend or a loved one. And today I am joined with my assistant pastor and youth pastor. And we all have something in common where we all have lost our dads. Yes, sir. And it all hit us in a different way. Yeah. And we're going to really talk about this today. And we're going to be very transparent with our viewing audience today. And first off, I'd like to know, how are you doing today?
Doing good, Pastor. Just got a few sips of our coffee here from Revive Cafe, so ready to go.
Wonderful. How are you doing, Reggie?
I'm doing very well. Very toasty in here. It was real nasty and stormy earlier with that snow, but I'm doing well.
I know. Can you believe it snowed today? I'm just totally shocked of that.
A lot of it too. I think we got about an inch. Probably.
Big time snow.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, we are at this time of recording, we're moving into the holiday seasons. I mean, Thanksgiving is right around the corner. And this is a time when you begin to reflect about the things that you appreciate. You begin to consider the value of family and the things that are important to you. And a lot of times people approach the holidays in a different fashion. Some people approach the holidays, they're excited about it, they're looking forward to all the wonderful times of coming together and exchanging and fellowshipping. Then others become dejected and discouraged. They start reflecting upon the loss of a loved one. So everyone responds differently. I want to say from the outset that death never comes on a time where you can schedule it. In other words, you can't really prepare yourself for the loss of a loved one. And even if they're ill and in the hospital, because death is so final, and we really were never really designed to correspond with death. We're designed to correspond with life. When God created Adam and Eve in the garden, he created them to live, and their bodies were designed to live forever. And unfortunately, because of sin, death entered into the body, and so now all mankind are on a cycle where we're born, and we die. The Bible says there is a time to live, and then there's also a time to die. So we're only here for a moment. We understand that. And when you have loved ones, when you have friends, when you have people that you're knitted to, and it's meaningful, the loss of a loved one is shocking. I can reflect back. I'm going to ask you guys this question too. But I can reflect back to 4 years old, the first time I had to deal with someone that died. Not a family member, but my father had apartment buildings, and he used to have this gentleman by the name, we called him Mr. Woods. He was probably in his upper 50s, maybe 58 to 62 years old. And he always helped my parents with the apartments. And he was so cordial and fun and friendly. And to me, he was family. And he would always have a sucker for me. He's like, hey, Michael, here's a sucker for you. So I looked forward to seeing him. He would always tell me what he was doing. And when he passed away, I couldn't relate to it. What do you mean he passed away? He died, and we went to the funeral. And I remember walking up there with my mom, and I said, why is he sleeping when we're all here? Is he going to get up? And I recall that. I couldn't correspond. And my mom was crying, and everyone there is mourning the loss of this wonderful man. He was such a good man. But that was my first experience. What about you guys?
Yeah, so my first experience was with my grandmother, my father's dad, which I only knew for a short portion of time. The time my father was in prison, she passed away. I was about 6 years old, and she died of cancer. I just remember going to the hospital, seeing her with all her hair gone, and then a week later, we're at a funeral. And I'm like, wow, what's this all about? Never experienced this.
How old were you?
I was between 6 and 7 years old. Okay. So it was kind of a stunner for me. Never seen it, trying to understand it. It was different.
Yeah. What about you, Reggie?
For me, actually, I went a long time without death coming close to me. I would have friends or peers at school who would pass. You know, I remember back in 2010, there was a peer that passed in a car accident, and it kind of rocked high school. I wasn't that close to him, but that was close enough for me to be like, wow, like, man, this is really tough for people. But for me, my first one was my grandfather, and it was actually in 2020. So I was 27 years old.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 26 at the time. He died actually 10 days before my 27th birthday, and yeah, it was a cold day, and he had been having heart problems for a while. I would say for the better part of a decade, close to a dozen years, and the Lord extended his life.
Yeah.
I gave him an opportunity to become saved. He lived with us for a while, and we had just left church. Went to drop off my now wife at her apartment, and I get a call from my mom, and she's just sobbing, and she's saying like, Daddy's gone, and I had to decipher what was happening, because she used to call my dad Daddy, but she also would call her Daddy as well.
Yeah.
And when I went there to the hospital and I saw him, just, man, that lifeless, cold body.
It's so final.
Oh, it is. And I think that's the part that was so hard for me. But 27 years old, my grandfather, my mom's dad.
I had that experience with Mr. Woods, and then when I wasn't until I was in my upper 40s when I started having some of my relatives, my uncle and so forth, pass. So it's like when you're not touched with death in the family or someone close to you, you almost think like life is expendable, like you're going to live forever. But when someone dies close to you, you realize how finite life is and how it's important that we live life correctly, and that ultimately that we respond correctly to loss. And we're going to look at the 5 stages here of grief. I really want our viewing audience to know today that God has answers for you and that you're not alone. And a lot of times when someone passes away, that's what you feel. You feel a great deal of loneliness. You don't know how to correspond with that. You don't know how to harness your emotions in that season of your life. And God understands all that. You got to understand that the Bible says in 2 Corinthians 1:3 that He is the God of all comfort and the Father of mercy. So you don't realize how important God is and how magnificent He is until someone passes away, and then all of a sudden there is a comfort there, but you have to welcome in His comfort. Jesus says, I'm not going to leave you comfortless. I'm going to send the Comforter to you, and I will be with you. And so you first have to understand that. But you really can't prepare yourself for death. Just recently, in just the last year and a half, I've had 6 people close to me die. Wow. My uncle passed away. My father passed away a few months later. Then it was my mother-in-law that passed away. Then it was my father-in-law that passed away. Then it was a pillar in the church that passed away, Daniel. And then now we just had Al pass away. And this, our first response to death in the process of recovery is shock. And because with most of those passings, we were prepared with illness and so forth. With the final one, there was no preparations at all. As far as we knew, he was healthy, functional, and moving about his day. And then all of a sudden, he passed without a moment's of notice. And so this was a shock for me. And so there is a portion of grief that you deal with the shock, the impact. It's almost like when you get in a car accident. What just happened? Did we just get in a car accident? Did this really just happen? Because it steps you out of your reality of what you know to be normal. Yeah. So now there's an abnormality and you got to correspond with the shock. When your father passed away, did you have a sense of shock when it happened? Were you able to prepare yourself?
Yeah, I was attempting to prepare myself, but I was numb for the most part because I did not want to believe that time was going to come, being a person of faith.
And that's really interesting because really, I will say that number one is denial, which is shock. Mm-hmm. So you had first stage grief even before he passed away.
Yeah.
There was a sense of deniability. And we know that God can do miracles.
That's right.
But the reality is when you're sitting there and their body's emaciated or something is there, God can do a miracle at any time. But while that's happening, it's hard to correspond with that. So there is a sense of denial. So you kind of were in that stage.
Yeah, I kept believing, and of course, different people were saying, hey, he's leaving. You got to let him go. That was tough because God actually did a miracle on my dad 12 years before that. He was supposed to die.
Right.
Family came to the hospital, and I went in there, believed that he was going to live, with the doctor saying, pay your respects, and God extended his life.
Yeah.
And now I'm thinking, okay, here we are again, but God, you can do this. But it was hard because even as a man, I felt the boy in me not wanting to let my father go. And so I keep going down memory lane, him holding me, him kissing me, him just, being affectionate. It was hard to think that was going to leave me. And so the reality didn't kick in.
Yeah. I remember being on the phone. You couldn't talk. It happened. We're on the phone, and I'm comforting you, but you were in shell shock when it happened. Also, Reggie, your dad passed away as well.
Yeah.
And boy, he was such a exceptional person. And he was really the strength of the family, and he did everything. How did you feel that first stage of grief is denial or shock? Did that hit you?
It hit me right away. I remember us being in the parking lot of the hospital, and we have a church member that actually worked at the hospital at the time, and we were communicating, and she's like, "Hey, listen." So just to preface it, he had been sick before. So my dad was a bigger man. He worked at the steel mill. He's a bodybuilder back in the Army. And for the viewing audience, I want to preface it. This is my stepdad. So I've been blessed to have two dads. I'm a junior, so I have my biological father who I love so dearly, and I thank God for him. But this was my stepdad, and really the man who kind of came in and shaped me to be the man who I am today, and the character that I have. And so he had they came back from a trip from Mexico, and he developed double lung pneumonia. After double lung pneumonia, he was able to go back to work. So he went back to work. He loved to work. He loved to work at the steel mill. He loved to just provide. It was a part of his nature. And so he went back to work, and he ended up developing double lung pneumonia about a couple weeks later. Went to urgent care. Urgent care said, "Oh, no, you got COVID." This was at the height of COVID. COVID had, I shouldn't say this was at the height of COVID. This is when it just started. So there's pandemonium everywhere. I mean, everybody's panicking. Nobody knows anything. And he developed COVID, sent him straight to the hospital, immediately into quarantine. We saw him when he left the house, and we didn't see him again until he was lifeless. And I remember we had left church again. It was on a Wednesday night, and we were at the hospital in the parking lot, and I'm outside the car, and I'm walking, and I'm praying, and I'm just praying. I'm like, God, you're not going to let this happen. You can't let him die. Like, that's no way this is going to happen. I'm doing everything. The church had been fasting. We had been praying. He had been in the hospital for about 10 days, and I'm like, there's no way he's going to die. I'm telling my mom, I can't wait till he gets home. He's going to have a powerful testimony. I can't wait to hear this. And so the denial started before it happened. And when I got the text from my mom that he was gone, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. We went into the hospital, and at that time, everything, you couldn't touch him, you couldn't see him. They were not allowing family members up. And I remember going into the hospital, and I'm trying to go up and comfort my mom. She's there by herself. And the security guard's like, "I can't let you up." And I was like, "Sir, please, like, my dad just died. Like, I have to go up. Like, I have to go." And I remember telling him this, and in the moment you just react. I remember, like, listen, you're either gonna have to arrest me or I'm gonna go up and see my dad. One of the two. And he just the doctor was like, "Just let him go." So I went up, and my mom was just, blank stare, just off. And she wasn't even there. And I think we were both in denial at that point. But it started before he passed, for sure.
And something, you bring up a point. You wanted to go see him because when a loved one or someone passes and you hear about it, part of the human response is that you want closure. You want to be able to see it. This is why in most cases they allow the family to come in, view the loved one, and be there. This is why we have funerals and so forth, because when you see it, it begins to register in your mind. And so that's very important. But one thing is this: when you're dealing with grief or the loss of a loved one, you've got to understand that there are stages here, and you have to make the decision to move forward. Now, there is that deniability. And when you are in shock, the second stage of grief is the distempered part of it. People get angry. My loved one is gone and I'm angry. And you got to be careful with that. And I do appreciate that both of you said on the outset of this podcast, you made the clarity and the distinction that you knew that God gave your father 12 extra years.
Yeah.
And so when you have a sense, and because we're wired inherently to like want to blame somebody. It's kind of like the human tendency. I have to blame, where's my outlet here? And so, but when you understand, wait a minute, God gave 12 years, for your dad. You brought up your grandfather. Hey, God gave 10 years. To your grandfather. And it's very important that when we're touched in that capacity, that we step back for a moment and we step into a moment of just appreciation. Okay, my emotions want to blame somebody. I'm going to blame the doctor. How many people have had a loved one? Oh, this surely is malpractice. Oh, we're going to have to sue the hospital. Oh, the doctor did this. And oh, this is because my mom didn't take care of my dad. And this is because, so that you start looking and navigating because you want an outlet and you get angry. And so what you have to do, you have to harness your emotions, harness your thoughts, and you have to step in and say, Lord, I've got to thank you for the years that I did have my loved one here. I've even had to do funerals for people that maybe babies that were born and, 6 months, a premature baby that was born that passed away. I've had to do a funeral for a child, and that's almost unconscionable dealing with this here. And people want to get upset, and I have to remind them, hey, listen, this is not the outcome that we want. And I provide reflections to the Word of God. David had a child that died, a baby that died, and he was so overwhelmed. But he said something so profound. It gives us insight to be able to appreciate in that moment something good in the face of the loss or the tragedy. And David says, I can't bring the child back to me, but one day I'm going to go to heaven and I'm going to see that child. So David didn't get angry. God, you let the baby die. God, you did this to me. And he didn't do that. David said, Lord, I can't go to that baby, but I know that your plan is bigger than this. And one day I'm going to go to the baby. But Reggie, that wasn't your story when your dad died. When your dad died, it so overwhelmed you. You didn't know how to respond. Yeah. So you went from denial and you got angry. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Man, David was a great man. He understood that real quick. I took the long road to understanding and I think the context around his death is what really pushed me into a place where I was angry so much. COVID had just happened. There were so many things happening at that time.
Yeah.
COVID had just started. I lost my granddad just 3 months prior. I love my mom. I grew up, I'm a mama's boy. And so I see my mom. And, when my grandfather had died, for days and weeks after, I had nightmares. And I would wake up in the middle of the night hearing my mother scream because her cry, I had never heard her cry like that ever in my life. And it pierced my heart. And I would wake up and just panicking because I would wake up and hear her scream. And so I remember seeing her go through that. And I remember her sitting at the funeral home with her husband, my dad, and I remember carrying my grandfather's casket behind him, and very, very honorable 21 gun salute, a very beautiful at the Abraham Lincoln Memorial Cemetery there in Illinois, and it was beautiful. And nobody knew that 3 months later, the very man that was standing next to her or in front of me, she would be burying. So much so that when we were back in the funeral home, the lady remembered my mom. She said, "You were just here. Who are you burying now?" And she said, "It's my husband." And I was very angry. I mean,
and the reason those emotions suffered you had the shock, but the anger set in because you felt it wasn't fair.
Ooh, yeah.
I'm not ready for this. This isn't fair.
Yeah.
Wait a minute here. Let me catch my breath.
Yeah, I felt overwhelmed. I felt like I was drowning with the circumstances of life. I've always been someone who dealt better, and I think we all are as human beings, but me particularly, I like to be in control of things. And this was one thing that I could not change.
Yes.
I had absolutely no control over this.
Yeah.
I prayed, we fasted, I brought everybody in that we could go in. We were just doing everything that we could that the Word of God told us to do. Mm-hmm. And I felt that because I put in that time, I put in that effort, I did everything that I was expected to do or told to do according to the Word of God, that the outcome should have worked the way that I planned it.
Yeah.
And we just talked about this, that it didn't go the way that I planned, but it ended up working for my good. But I couldn't see that because it's easy to talk about how the storm when you're standing on the outside of it, but when you're in the middle of it, man, it is beating you down and it's tearing you up. And so I went into a place where I became angry. And you said something earlier, we look for someone or something to blame, and I blamed everything. The doctors, the nurses, you talked about malpractice. I mean, that was a common conversation at the dinner table. We got all the medical records and I'm looking over everything. What is this? And why did they do this? And what is that? And why did they give him this much medicine? And why did they give him a paralytic? And why didn't they call us? And why did they not let me in there? And I'm standing outside and I'm praying. And I was so angry because when I went to the hospital, I got to the place where, I blamed everything that was surrounding me.
Yeah.
And
when you love hard, you hurt hard.
That's good.
yeah.
And when you love hard and there is that connection, there's a safe place there. There's never going to be a good time to let go.
No.
And when you're in those throes and you feel those emotions, where you feel angry, I want you to understand the sovereignty of God. And that's what I talked to you about in that moment.
Yep, you did.
That in God's sovereignty, before he set time forward, before he unfolded his plan, everything began with his logos, the word. And that word, logos, means the mind of God. It includes the plan of God and the purpose of God. And every human being that is born, God knows them before they go into their mother's womb. So God's got a name for them. God knows the hairs on their heads. He knows them intimately. And on God's time clock, we're only here for a moment. Yeah. And when someone says, well, yes, I understand it, but, I lost my family to COVID. I lost this, and they were only, 40, and they were only, God understands it so much that when Jesus came to this earth, Jesus didn't die as an infant, and Jesus didn't die as an old man. God says, I want to relate to my creation. I'm going to have my son die at 33 years old, that I can feel the pain that human beings would feel, and I would be able to provide that love for them, that even when they get angry, I'm going to wrap my arms around them. My grace and my patience is going to be with them. And so it is a process, but we realize, God, your plan is greater than my pain.
Yeah.
Your plan is greater than my pain.
Yeah,
and Lord,
good.
I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to stay in anger. I have to go through anger, but I'm not going to stay in anger because they could have never been a part of my life. But thank God your stepdad was a part of your life.
I'm grateful.
Thank God those years that you had with your father, those 12 years. My father passed away, and I thank God that I've always been a son, that I served my parents. I was always there. I felt the responsibility, the necessity to be there. And the last 12 years of my father's life, he was a part of this ministry, a soul winner. I got to build memories with him that I didn't really have as a young boy. And so I look to that, and I said, thank you, Jesus. And I'm grateful. And because once you begin to do that, and you begin to express that appreciation, thanksgiving, now you're allowing God to come in. You're letting go of your anger. You're stepping outside of your flesh. You're stepping outside of your struggle. Now you're starting to let God to come in. Yep. And then there's a process here that we go through where there is mourning. There is mourning. And mourning hits you really hard with your dad. Talk to us a little bit about the mourning with your dad.
Yeah, I mean, it was heavy because, my story is very mixed with my father. Brother Reggie talked a little bit about that anger. I dealt with some of those similarities, trying to find scapegoats as to why he got to this point. And part of my anger had to do with my upbringing and what I didn't get. And then, as weird as this may sound, I had anger towards my dad. And so you factor that mixture with my mourning, right? Because he was a product of something that he didn't have, right? He was fatherless. And so there was these missing elements. And again, it's the boy in me that's still crying out, Papi,
Yeah.
And
we all go through that. And there's someone watching right now that you lost your dad, you lost your grandfather, and that part of you wants to cry out and yearn, and it wants to go through this denial and being distempered. Then you get depressed, and guess what? It's okay to be down. God doesn't want you to be a robot.
Yeah.
When you begin to sink into this sense where you were dispirited, you were down, and almost like you feel like you're flatlining. Like I want to pull the blanket over my head. I just don't want to. I don't want to see another tomorrow because of what's happening. God relates to all of that, and God says, "Hey, that's okay. You can go through that. You went through that." And the Bible tells us, in Deuteronomy chapter 34, and this is really interesting. And I do want you to elaborate more, but. It's just so interesting to me because the children of Israel was probably the most rebellious congregation to any pastor that you can think of. They were so rebellious to Moses. They were always murmuring about Moses, complaining about Moses. Moses, you brought us out into the wilderness to die. Moses, you did this. And Moses, God, you gave me these people. What am I going to do with these people? Kill me if I got to deal with these people. And he kept dealing with them. And for 40 years, he pastored them in the wilderness. And Acts tells us it was a church in the wilderness. And then all of a sudden, Moses dies. All of a sudden, there was a cry all throughout Israel because their pastor is dead.
Yeah.
And can you imagine how they felt? Man, we didn't listen to him. We complained all the time, but he was our leader. He was a shining light. And they were crying out to God. And, God could have turned around and said, something, all you did was complain. All you do, this is what you get. He's gone. That's not what God did.
No.
God says, Joshua, you're my guy. I've got a plan. So understand this. When a loved one passes away, God's got a plan. God has someone else there that's not going to replace them, but it's going to stand in that gap and provide for you what you used to get for them. And they're going to become meaningful to you, and you're going to build new memories, and you're going to have a fresh start with that. And God chose Joshua to do that. And then God told the children of Israel, hey, go ahead and mourn. Allow yourself to be sad. Cry for 30 days. But after 30 days, I want you to get up, change your clothes. It's time to move forward.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so it's important to understand that there is a time of mourning. You're not robotic. Your emotions are real to you. You're going to be sad. You're going to be down. How long were you in that state of mourning?
I would say about a good year. The first probably 60 days was really, really tough. But I found my mourning in my morning, if that makes sense. Because, I began to reflect back, and I remember reading a quote at the time, legacy is not something that is left for you, it's what someone leaves in you.
Yeah.
And so I had to really reflect on the good that came out of my father, because during that time, it was tough. I mean, I was with him through his whole journey towards the end, especially. I literally stood in a hospital 2 weeks with him. Didn't get out. This was during COVID.
Remember. Yeah.
They wouldn't even let people stay, but I wanted to be attached to the hip. And so that morning was really, really tough. I couldn't shake it off, but I started looking at the good, and then I find myself to this day giving that to my children. My dad was very affectionate, right?
Yeah, he was.
That legacy he left. Another thing I read before, legacy is like a garden that someone plants that they'll never get to see come to fruition. And I really feel good because out of that morning, I was able to reflect on the good of my experience with my father. So it really changed me a lot. And until this day, I think about my father. As a matter of fact, last week, that was the celebration or anniversary of his death. And so this is very close, this podcast, to that timing.
Absolutely.
But mourning changed me a lot, but it made me better. And I can say that now I look at it with value. I value those tears and those opportunities to cry.
And let me say this to you too. You're not weak for mourning.
Yeah.
And even when you look at God's beautiful plan of salvation, it starts with death, burial, and resurrection. It starts with mourning. So you can't even experience salvation until you go through mourning.
Yeah.
Then in the process of that mourning, there's got to be a burial.
Yeah.
There's got to be a time to say, you know something, I got to put this mourning away. God still has a plan for me. And in that plan, I've got to choose to go forward.
Yeah.
How were you with the mourning of your dad? How long did it take you to get through that process?
It took me a long time. I would say about the time span of, like Brother Malkimos said, maybe a little bit less, about 8 months or so. But the funny thing about mine is I didn't know I was mourning. And you said, you don't have to be robotic, and God doesn't want you to be a robot. But I was never shown, because it happened to me at all of a sudden, and I never experienced it before. And also, I was still under the impression that I don't have to grieve. I don't need to grieve. It's okay. Like, this is a part of life.
Yeah.
I was very robotic. I was extremely robotic.
Especially you carry that mantle to be strong for your family. So you were like, I can't break down. I've got to be strong. I got to be strong for my mom. I got my siblings, all of that. So I understand that.
Yeah, it was tough. I mean, having to be that for my family. There was always a great relationship between myself and my family in that regard. But now that my dad was gone, it was really that I had to step up to the plate. I mean, the youngest was 13 years old. I mean, the oldest at the time was 22 years old. And then here I am, and I have to be that for my parents. And my mom is trying to be strong, but I know she's breaking down. I mean, she moved away to Texas to get away from everything that was here. And at the time, I was mourning so many different things. I had felt that everything that I had known God to be to me in that season was a lie. My mind was blocked with so many things. I got to the point where I literally told God, like, this is not fair, right? You said I didn't think it was fair. I told God, this is not fair. And either everything that I was taught was a lie, or everything that's happening right now is within your will. And you've got to show me one of them.
Yeah.
And he showed me that it was in his will. And that very same day, you called me and you explained to me the sovereignty of God. And though at the time I was being hard-headed, I was hurt, I was very hardened in my heart, I heard what you said, and I understood it. Yeah. And so the mourning for me, it took a long time, and I heard a lot of feelings in the meantime, because it was, when it did come out at one time, it was very brash. It was I lost control of who I was.
Yeah. I want to say to someone watching today that many times if you have an estranged relationship with a loved one, you're on the wrong side of that relationship and you're begrudging that relationship. And while they're still alive and they're still here, you can still build history. You can mend that relationship if you choose to put the past behind you. And a lot of times it's not until a funeral takes place that all of a sudden, okay, there's closure here. And all of a sudden people can remember, oh, I remember they did this. I remember this good. And it's too late. You can't build history. You can't have that meaningful relationship that in the sunset years of your life, you can reflect back, because we are a sum total of the meaningful relationships that we have in our life. Yeah. That's what makes us up. And it's easy to harbor a grudge, but you don't realize when you're harboring a grudge, you're wasting precious time. And there was a generation that failed in a lot of different ways. But, it takes the grace of God, and God has that grace for people to say, let me put this behind me. Let's mend this. Let's build history. Let's allow love to cover a multitude of sin. And I want to encourage you today that if you're estranged with your mom or your dad or your grandparents or what have you, go to them. And because a lot of time you try to hold a loved one to a standard that you're not even keeping yourself.
That's good.
That is good.
And you gotta see your place in the story Where is your responsibility in this? You can't just say, you didn't, you didn't, you didn't. What about you? Because we're flawed people.
Yeah.
And we're imperfect. And we live in a generation today has no value for family. So you're not going to get the value of family from a television show or on the radio or anything else. There's a dismantling of it. Yeah. You got to understand, you are the sum total of your family. And there is a moral wiring that you love unconditionally. Love unconditionally. Heal. Build memories. And in doing so, when they pass away, you can sit there and say, boy, I thank God. I thank God for those years. I thank God for the 12 years that I had with my dad. I thank God for, with any relationship like that. And so I think that's very, very important. We're going to go to the final stage. The final stage is deployment. Now let's go over this real quick. There is denial. There is being distempered, being angry. There is defeat where you mourn. There's depression where you go through just that 30 days of preparing yourself to be able to recover. And then there's this deployment. I'm going to get back up and I've got to move on with my life, because life does not shut down for you. And you got to get up and you got to move forward, because you have responsibility. And it puts life in perspective, because you realize how fragile life is. But God told the children of Israel, mourn for 30 days, then get yourself up, back up, and then change your clothes and go forward. God told David, David himself, he felt inspired to, the Bible says he wiped his tears. He got up. He changed his clothes. He went into the house of God and he worshiped. And we've got to learn to do that. We have to learn to fully recover, in the sense that we're going to go on. And in our recovery, we have to realize how great God is, because God will not allow you to experience loss without leaving a piece of that loved one with you. It's called memories. Yeah. God provides memories. And when you have a lost loved one, I'm telling you, the good, the bad, and the ugly are so significant, I think of memories of my dad when he would get mad and yell at me and whatever. I said, man, I miss that. I miss one of those last, what are you doing? Help me carry the groceries when we were a kid, or whatever it was. But you got to harness those memories. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father above. Memories are a gift from God. And if you have a loved one that's passed, I want to encourage you during the holiday seasons, talk about them. Keep them alive. Because the more you talk about them, the more you celebrate them, there's something in you that's healing on the inside. And so this is how you recover. And I think that's very significant.
Absolutely.
This has really, really been, I think, a very needful conversation to have today. I think we've outlined it well. I want to thank both of you for taking the time out and being here and opening your heart. And I want to kind of move to final thoughts. What are the final thoughts that we have today, Brother Malkimos?
Yeah, I would say, for a loved one that's close, it's not what you remember, it's how you remember. You're always going to have memories, good, bad, ugly. But at the end of the day, you choose how do you want to remember that person. For me, my father, it's becoming the man that he desired to be, that he wanted.
Yes.
And so, take the good, those memories that were edifying, build off of that, and make that legacy last for that loved one.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
No, that's really good. And for me, excuse me. And for me, I would say a lot of times when we're going through life and we occur a death, we tend to die at that death. Some of us, or a piece of us, tends to die with that person, and we forget to live on. Life still goes on, as you said earlier. And the ironic part about it is I eulogized him at his funeral, and I said the most important thing that we have to remember in this room is that we have to continue to live life. But yet, I was dying on the inside and didn't even notice it because I was separated. I separated myself from God. So if ever you incur a loss and it's going to be damaging, hold on to God, worship. I had that conversation with you, Pastor, and we began to talk, and you began to instill in me and to tell me things that I needed to do. And I went home and I went into that prayer closet and I just began to worship God. Yeah. I didn't even know what to pray. I didn't even know what to say to him. I just began to worship and sing worship unto him, and he just began to chip away at my heart, and just things began to fall off, and he began to build me up. And I'm so very grateful for the relationship that you and I have. I'm very grateful for you in every season of my life. And just as you said earlier, make sure that you mend those relationships. Listen, time flies by real quick. I blinked and that was it. That was all of his life. And just make sure you mend those relationships. Make sure you love God first so you can love them properly, but also love everyone.
That's it.
Yeah,
That's it.
Stay connected.
You know, I want to say in conclusion, don't go through this alone. When you're going through these stages, you want to isolate yourself. Don't isolate yourself, because when you isolate yourself, you really have to deal with the abundance of emotions and thoughts and ideas that you're not designed to go through it alone. I want you to reach out to somebody, reach out to a loved one. Sometimes you just need to step out of that space and be around family and friends and be faithful to the house of God. Maybe you're watching today and you're on your journey with Jesus. You're just at the first level. I'm telling you, when you realize that life is a vapor or life is short, you realize how important eternity is. And you don't want to go into eternity without Jesus. And Jesus is as far as the mention of his name. Even right where you're at, you can call Jesus, Jesus, I need your help. And I promise you his presence will come into that room where you're at.
Yeah.
And it's just so important to get into a Bible-based church, a church that where you're going to not only hear the gospel, but the presence of God is strong. That's just so important. I want you to know that we are going to be praying for you, and I know that God's going to get you through this situation. And today, if this video has helped you, why don't you like and subscribe and make sure you share it with somebody. We need to help people get through the journey of grief. God bless you, and we'll see you on the next podcast. If the podcast today has blessed you and you see great value in it, I'd like for you to like and subscribe and make sure you share it with somebody. Help us revive someone else's life. Thank you.